Well, thank you.
Let's go.
Good afternoon and welcome back to Theology Thursday. We're back. Good to see you again. Thank you for tuning in to Theology Thursday. We've been on a little bit of a hiatus, being recharged, rejuvenated, and ready to give you information. So we are back now, and I'd like to welcome our guests, Dr. Small, Pastor Johnny Jackson, Dr. Danielle Bahuro, and our very own leading it today, Reverend Kim.
Amen. Amen. God is faithful. God is faithful.
We're
recording.
So today, since we are back, we're going to have, and this is June, we're going to talk, the focus is on Juneteenth. Juneteenth, what does it mean? And we're going to break that down for you today. And we're coming from Joshua 4. And with that, I'd like to open up the discussion. And once again, thank you for tuning in.
All right. So as we converse and dialogue, we want to set a little backdrop for the celebration of Juneteenth. Contrary to popular belief, President Donald Trump did not expose it to the country. It was already understood and already made aware that Juneteenth is a short terminology for June 19th, which is the day or the moment or the time when federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas in 1865 to take control of the state and ensure that the enslaved people were freed. Up until that point, the Emancipation Proclamation had been declared, but up until that point in Texas, Africans were still operating in the context and the mindset of enslaved individuals. I think that's important, that there's a mindset that Africans did not know they were free. And I think that part of this conversation is that it's not just in 1865 when we realize that I think some people, we can argue that there are many of us in our culture that are realizing that each and every day. The different structures, different things that are taking place that look to enslave and, to dispower the African-American community, African-American individuals, the African-American psyche, the African-American mental health. And so I think it's important that we talk about what it is to commemorate Juneteenth for the specific understanding of nothing else, for the specific understanding of really coming to grips, and this is important, but really coming to grips with what the country believes and thinks about African people and descendants of people who are descended from Africa. I don't think in these Theology Thursdays, I think we can be incredibly honest with each other to understand that we have a lot of examples to where we are reminded as to how this country operates, thinks, and processes people of color. And so I think, Juneteenth is one of those places. Just this week, we are commemorating what has taken place in Tulsa, what took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 1921, that the race riot that literally took place. And understanding also, and we need to understand this as much as we're talking about Tulsa, that is one of many race riots that took place throughout the country. And that there are several different places. Public service announcement, I encourage you all, if you have not, go to the Justice Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, that was put together by Brian Stevenson, and you will see the history of the attempt to disempower people of color in this country. And so I think it's important for us to look at and to understand the power of remembrance, understand the power of Sankofa, what it is to go reach back and get it, and to understand our story and our history. Ain't that right, Dr. Bahuro? That's Sankofa.
Yes, 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 yes.
Yeah, that Sankofa is significant. There's something about that Sankofa.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
So as we're just talking about,
what is Sankofa?
Sankofa
What is Sankofa?
Okay, Sankofa is an Adinkra. It's an Adinkra, well, it's Ashanti, but it's an Adinkra symbol, Adinkra symbolic language images. And Sankofa is a word that simply means reach back and get it, or go back and get it. And oftentimes the illustration of Sankofa is a bird that is reaching back to get an egg off of its back as it's facing forward. With the understanding that you can't understand where you are going until you understand where you are from. And that is like for, I think, the essential place for, I'm speaking not only as a pastor and preacher and as a person of color, but as a mental health professional. I think that is essential for what it is we are talking about doing and how we function. And what we need, particularly as people of color, to understand the story so we can understand the strength that goes within the story. Joshua 4, as Dockery talked about, talks about a story about the crossing over of the Jordan River of God's people. And what Joshua has the people do is reach for 12 stones, which represent the 12 tribes of Israel at the bottom of the river, when God stopped the flow of the river that allowed the people to cross over into the promised land. And Joshua takes those stones, has those stones taken from the bottom of the riverbank, and he builds them as a monument. And the big piece is in, I think, around verse 21 or verses 21 through 24, where it says, so when they ask you, the generations that come behind you ask you, what do these stones mean? You will be able to tell them that this is where the people of God crossed over on the Jordan, that the story is told about what God has done for the people of God. And so Juneteenth is a commemoration, understanding and speaking about Tulsa, speaking about Rosewood, speaking about Selma, speaking about marches is indeed a commemoration. It's a memory, it's a memorial to understand what has taken place and how we apply this to our lives, and understanding what God has done through those things. I think that is part of the Theology Thursday mantra, to really understand and to wrestle with what God is telling us and what God is talking about. So I'm gonna be quiet and let Reverend Kim build on that, of Dr. Jackson or somebody else.
It's funny you should speak on that, remembering. I've been doing some consulting work with the park district here, and several organizations have called about reserving some of the parks for a Juneteenth celebration. A Juneteenth celebration. We want to bring in DJs. We want to bring in all of this. And I'm thinking, has it turned into, or do they really know the past? Have they really looked back and understood what this is about? Or has it turned into just another opportunity to barbecue and do the chosen few DJs or something like that? It just scares me.
Hold on 1 second. Honey, cancel that DJ and that barbecue for Juneteenth that we playing. We're not gonna do that no more. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. Okay, thanks.
I'm done.
Sorry, I got a little convicted there. I'm sorry. Okay. Have my house music ready.
Right.
Okay.
So Dockery, it's interesting that you say that. I think again, Juneteenth was a celebration of freedom. And so they had a party and it went on for quite some time in that celebration, because mind you, it's 18 months later that they get the news. So they are celebrating. I'm sure they had a thank you, Jesus moment in prayer, and they celebrated for that. So it is a celebration when you go to Galveston, Texas. It is a celebration of that. They parade, they celebrate. It's a remembrance of the enslaved being set free. So it is a celebration. And so most people use it as a celebration. It's a celebration of the culture as we talk about the laying of stones. So it is the remembrance of a time but we're celebrating. We're no longer in that time. So it is a celebration, just like it's supposed to be like our Independence Day, like July 4th. You
Okay.
know, we celebrate that. So there is a celebration piece to that. So Dr. Bahiro, go ahead and get the DJ and the barbecue and I'll be over. It is a celebration. Over there by our church, we're having a block party. We're collaborating with a Just Harvest. So we're having a block party and we're painting the streets Black Lives Matter and we're having a celebration, so that we can also inform people about it. So yes, there's some history and some teaching, but at the end of the history and teaching, there's a celebration. This is our Independence Day, in which we, the enslaved, were set free. So it's a celebration of our ancestors and the work and the commitment they have done, and we're moving forward. So it is a celebration. So it'll be nice in the celebration to do a ritual in honor of, in celebration of our ancestors who worked the field, because we're only about 4 or 5 generations removed. My great grandfather was the first one out of slavery, but not his parents. And so we are only 4 generations removed from slavery. So I like people to know that. They act like it's a long time ago, but if we're only 4 generations removed from that, 4 to 5 generations removed from that. So it is a celebration. And when people talk about did Trump bring it on, it wasn't Trump that brought it on. It was the whole racial tension that happened last year during this time. It was when Black Lives Matter say enough is enough. We're going to celebrate and embrace us. And so we started to move this Juneteenth celebration to the forefront, where before it was in the back, we moved it to the front. So it wasn't the Trump, it was the George Floyd, the tension piece that we do matter, and we're going to celebrate all that matters to Black and Brown people. And so it is our way to celebrate, because it's not really another holiday in which we celebrate that's particularly to us. We do Kwanzaa for those who celebrate, but then people want to protest that because they don't want to give up Christmas. So this is another opportunity that is very cultural, that is very significant to the African American community, a day of celebration. It is our Independence Day.
Yeah, I think what, and I don't, correct me if I'm wrong. What I heard Dockery saying is that not so much the celebration, but are we caught up? Are we going to allow it to get commercial?
There we go.
Right, the commercialism of it, right? Like I remember when we were taking off. I say we, meaning people of color, Black folk, were taking off. We were taking the Monday of Martin Luther King's Day, right? Because it was not a holiday. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm that old now. I'm like, I am that old now, where my mother was like, no, you're not going. And we went to somebody's church, we went to somebody's community center, and there was a rally, there was a this, there was a that. And when Reagan, under great pressure, made King's birthday a national holiday, we were nonetheless elated, but in a lot of ways it commercialized it. It almost lessened it. You know what I mean? It normalized it in a way, and it didn't bring it out. And so, and if you can believe this, for Trump to give it credence and who was actually worse than Reagan, we have to be careful. I think I guess that's just what I'm saying, that we have to be, preserve and keepers of the very, very significance and importance of what this is. Because if it's not, we have seen in this country that they will minimize something quickly. They will minimize the tragedy and the atrocities that have been done to African people, and they will do it in the quicks. They will reduce it. Right now, the very place where Juneteenth was established is now one of the places where they're trying to call slaves workers in history books. You know what I mean? I mean, it's this kind of stuff that the revisionist history of what's taking place, and we have to be very, very careful about it.
I guess for me, Juneteenth, like Memorial Day, the history of Memorial Day is just so, is really powerful that it started
Yeah.
with African people who went to the grave, the mass graves of of our people had been buried there, and they dug up those graves to give them some honor, and they began to remember them, and then America catches on and called it Memorial Day, when our people were remembering our dead. And so Juneteenth for me is another opportunity for us to take deep dives into how our people navigated, and how they navigated this horrible system of chattel slavery, and also how they, in navigating it, how they held on based on a bunch of what they brought with them from the continent. And so it helps us begin to understand, for me, helps us begin to understand that our people, first of all, didn't come, when they were dragged to these shores with a tabula rasa. In other words, they didn't come with a blank slate of not understanding. They knew God before they got here. They knew God by many different names. Also, they had some traditions that they brought. I'm really digging the Netflix documentary High on the Hall, because the brother does what a lot of people would not do. He goes back to the continent, in particular Benin, and he begins to look at how our people were first of all, it was just so magnificent that he went to that particular spot where the people were living in that water community, and the legend behind that, and then to begin to be served food that only a few people knew how to still make, because it was the same food that our people ate before white folk came to enslave them. It's just magnificent. And then to see how, bringing even the food as a way of not only remembering, where we come from, taking a piece of that, but also holding on to that in this particular land of our sorrows, is important. And so what were the people that in Galveston, what were they like? First of all, you can be certain they weren't Christian.
Right.
Our people did not latch on to European Christianity until much, much later. And so, because they were very suspicious of any religion that would allow you to do this and treat us this way, because our folk knew that, we've been knowing God, from the Valley of the Moons, Kilimanjaro, when God scooped up dirt and made humans in his image. We've been knowing God for a long time, and God don't act like this, or God's people don't act like this. And so, it's fascinating for me for us to take deep dive into understanding, how our people navigated, how they dealt with it, and how they held on to their somebodyness. And that's why I don't like calling them slaves. They were enslaved. Our people fought at every turn. They were fighting. Even in High on the Hall, the sister talked about the ability to resist. So they were trying to feed them on those boats that gruel, that mush, and our people were not used to eating that. And so the resistance they did was close your mouth, and we're not eating that, until they began to form these different type tools to force open people's mouths, breaking teeth, to pour that crap down their mouth. But our people were resisting. And that's important, because we get such a picture that our people had just accepted this system, when, and we don't even want to talk about, because it upsets white folk, how they learn how to, shave stuff into the food of the slave owner, and slave owners got mysteriously sick and died as a way of fighting back. Many of our people don't want to see that, but it was resistance. And so how were these people in Galveston, how were they holding on? How were they enduring? What kind of things did they bring with them that helped them hold up under such intense horrors and beatings and brutality. So that's the fascinating part for me, that it gives us the opportunity to study deeper about our own people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the to your point, the High on the Hog, it is incredibly informative and empowering, and I think it whets the appetite, which all information should do at some point, right? It should whet the appetite and make us curious about what else we can know, and our pursuit to know more, our desire to know more. I think a lot of times what happens is we hear about the same stories, so we lose interest as individuals, right? We hear about Harriet Tubman, we hear about Frederick Douglass, we hear about the Underground Railroad, we hear about Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and maybe 2 or 3 other people, right? And we deem that history, but then we also hear about the suffering, right? We hear about Edmund Pettus Bridge, we hear about 16-3 Baptists, we hear about lynching, we hear about those things. And so once our minds get trained enough, we get caught up and say, okay, well, in terms of our history, what else is there, right? We can get lost in that. People can get lost in that. And I think things like Juneteenth really empower us to understand that there is so much more, like you were saying, there's so much more to the story and what the story entails. And so it becomes part of the work that we have to do, particularly as clergy people, right? I mean, what kind of responsibility as clergy do we have, right? To share in the total story, right? To include this in the gospel, right? What kind of assignment does that hold, to do that, to include the history in the gospel? And how do you think we are faring in that, like now?
Probably individually, there are persons and places like those who are on this Zoom right now, each of you, who are actually endeavoring to not just give our parishioners placebo Christianity, the shout, the feel good, but give depth. Overall, is a very difficult thing because unfortunately, many of our clergy sisters and brothers have a colonized Christianity mindset, so that it's a European way of seeing the faith rather than away from our African spirituality. So, and I think that we still have a lot of work, which is why the explosion of documentaries and discussions are extremely helpful. From Exterminate All the Brutes, HBO Max is excellent to see. And we mentioned High on the Hog. The important thing about it is that the brother did not start in slavery. Mm-hmm. As John Henry Clark said, if you start at the worst part of your story, you will always relive that. You will always experience that. That will be the ceiling of your story. And our story didn't start there. And so the brother goes to the continent, to the beginning. And so I think that overall, too many of our clergy colleagues either don't know, are ashamed, afraid, or just don't see the value in us as a people before, the institution of slavery, and then how we integrated our African spirituality into what we know as this Western Christianity. I think many of our people listen to white people talking about, the backwardness and pushing back on whether it was Santeria in Cuba or Candomblé in Brazil or Bodun in Haiti or Kumina in Jamaica. You know, many of our folk have listened to, you know, white folks saying, "Oh, that's you know, that's this worship, that's devil worship," that's all, not understanding the power of the spirituality that was there.
Right.
And I think because it's actually layered in the Bible, and I'm gonna leave it at this. Some of the spirituals we sing, take for instance, "Steal Away to Jesus." There's a line that says, "I hear my God a calling in the thunder." Our ancestors actually are referencing Shango, the West African god of thunder, you know, in late putting that line in there. And Henry Mitchell, in his book Black Belief, talked about how, especially down south, Black folk would go out when it looked like the storm was coming. They take an axe and chop up the backyard, because in our belief system, the lightning would go into the ground where you chopped it up. The axe is Shango's symbol. And so I think that many of our colleagues are afraid of that because they think that it's somehow going against Jesus Christ, when in reality it is not. That's a whole nother class. That's a whole nother discussion about how we marry and merge, you know, that. But I'll leave it at that.
I think that's a mic drop. I think they call that a mic drop.
Right. That's a teacher moment. Go ahead, Pastor.
Come on, y'all. Come on. I'm just trying to keep up with y'all. Yeah.
Something that is resonating for me, and I had to figure out what I was going to say in light of this mic drop that totally made me forget everything I was going to say. I hope it doesn't sound too stupid coming behind that.
Oh my God.
Now I feel like it's Girl Scout cookies and Superman. Okay, something that I always have wrestled with when we talk about African enslavement, or we talk about Juneteenth and the horror of African enslavement, is the ways in which we have never fully dealt with the trauma of being enslaved. And so I so appreciate the biblical passage that we are highlighting, and I so appreciate this Joshua 4 text. But there's a yearning that I have in which I would love to have asked Joshua, what about the mental health of the brothers and sisters coming out of this enslavement? Yes, it's important to lay these 12 stones down at this Jordan River to remember the story. Yes. And at the same time, I'm wrestling with what about the psychological trauma of being enslaved? Oftentimes we talk about the trauma of a kidnapping, if you will. Whenever someone has been kidnapped, right now there's the biggest issue or plight facing African American women are the high rates of kidnappings of Black women today. And there's no outcry about that. Now, that's another entirely different conversation for discussion. But there are some sisters who have been found, and immediately now there are new health reports published saying there is so much mental health therapy that one who has been kidnapped and tortured now has to participate in and engage because of the psychological terror that person's experience. And so as we talk about our people in this Joshua 4 text, I'm left wondering about the state of their mental health, and how do we, as we think about African enslavement, how do we begin to address the psychological terror and trauma that I believe we're still wrestling with, that has not been talked about. It has never been talked about, never addressed, never even acknowledged. And so I think while we're celebrating, in addition to celebrating our freedom and our Independence Day, in addition to what I hear Pastor John Jackson saying, is celebrating our identity before enslavement. I think it is so important for us also to spend some time also giving brothers and sisters resources for psychological healing. And so as we think about June 19th festivities, I'm wanting to also encourage us to think about, man, what would it look like to have some psychologists or some mental health therapists with the barbecue and DJ too, to say, hey, let's talk. Let's talk.
Is there, Doc, in your opinion, is there healing in the remembering? Is there therapy in the remembering? Or is there enough? Or is there enough healing in the remembering?
I don't like to talk in either or, so I like to use both and. So yes, the remembering could be the remembering could be healing, and at the same time, I also think there needs to be more in that, because what we often don't talk about is in the act of being enslaved, which causes psychological terror and trauma, a particular psychological dynamic that builds within the person that has been kidnapped is shame and guilt.
Right.
Shame and guilt. And so we have not, I say, done enough to address what is the shame and the guilt that we have experienced, or that is now what we are left with as a result of being enslaved, kidnapped and enslaved, and now having to deal with psychological trauma and terror. And so the remembering piece, I don't believe will help us deal with the psychological impact of shame and guilt that we now wrestle with. And so I'm really interested in this piece around shame and guilt. Shame and guilt shows up in the form of, I didn't apply for this job because I didn't believe I was worthy enough. You know, right. I've always wanted to start my own business, but I didn't feel like I was smart enough to right. be able to handle the administrative functions or the entrepreneurship of starting my own business. Right. That's the impact of African enslavement. African enslavement says that I need to be in a relationship with someone just because it's somebody to have, because I'm not deserving of someone who will love me for me and allow us to be in a healthy relationship. So now I got to be in a toxic Jada Pinkett, Will Smith type of relationship, right? Oh man, I slipped. I'm so sorry. I slipped.
Right.
No red table?
I'm sorry. Right? That's the way shame and guilt shows up for us in our lives. It shows up in those ways with me, you know, saying to my 12-year-old son, if you know the answer to something, you go ahead and raise your hand. And he says, but Ma, all the white kids raised their hand first. So I just kept my hand down. I'm like, no, you raise your hand. Right. That's the way that shame and guilt it shows up. And so I'm thinking, what are the ways in which we can begin to address that? In addition to partying and celebrate freedom, how do we wrestle with, you know, addressing mental health in that?
Yeah, in our next couple of weeks, we'll probably go in depth with the mental health piece. I think most of the time we were walking around not even understanding that we have mental health. Some people, we all walk around with PTSD. We don't even know it till something happens and it triggers it for us. That's really just one piece of it. But I think to even start having conversations about it in safe places and sacred places, of like having these conversations of, what are you feeling? How did you, like last year this time, as we're cleaning up riots and still marching, there was a lot of rage and anger and a lot of things, trauma that was happening during that time. And to have conversations about that during that time, it was really hard for people. They're like, we're exhausted. I don't want to talk about it anymore. And this whole thing, we just say we're exhausted. That's just our word. We're exhausted. We don't want to talk about this anymore. Not even understanding internally how we're dealing with it, because we're dealing with it, whether we want to talk about it or not. We're dealing with it, but it's internal. It's the struggle that we're fighting internally, because we're dealing with it, because we got to get up every day and we got to walk into places and spaces. So we are dealing with it. We're just not articulating it, how we're dealing with it. Even in our own churches, there's been that same type of guilt and shame, and all of that has happened because there has been this legacy, this tradition that has been passed down even in the church, that has made it kind of hard.
It's been weaponized. It's been weaponized.
To be something. The brush harbors were really nice, but when we start coming into organized church, we had to take on some different doctrines that were different than the one that Dr. Jackson had mentioned, of our own African indigenous religions that were part of who we were. And we didn't have a problem with that at first until, we got colonized into religion. And, it was shameful to have the shouts. It was shameful to bring in the ancestors, the gods that we know. It's only one true God, right? We got a mono God working here, and not the other gods that our ancestors who also looked up to, who also heard them and they believe worked with them. So it's so much balled up into what we want to call mental health, guilt, shame, all of that. It's just balled up into so many different avenues that we could do. But as we just look at this whole Juneteenth, I mean, imagine 18 months, people have been free for 18 months. So y'all been sitting here in shackles. And like people knew, they just didn't say nothing. The news was there. They just didn't tell them the news until somebody got word and the federal people came and said something. But people knew. they got word, but it's that they kept them, and so they were excited that, oh, we free, not even thinking that we were still enslaved for 18 months after the president had announced that we were done. And so, they was like, we'll just figure out our 40 acres and a mule and keep going. And so again, how we've come out of enslaved situations is just a whole different things. And then we bring that to our children who were not born into slavery, some are not, but we bring some of that enslaved mentality from generations to generations because that's what we've learned to know.
That the psychologist, I can't think of her last name, and I think she passed away. I know her first name, Patricia something. She did some incredible research to demonstrate that the trauma of slavery is epigenetic. It is passed down through our DNA. And Dr. Joy DeGruy has also, as a sociologist and whatnot, has also, done in her leg, shown that, the trauma is passed down and we've never been allowed to heal. Because part of healing is what? Truth telling. We've got to be able to say, you all did this and you owe us. And you got to be able to say, that, without folks saying, well, no, we don't want to remember that. We don't want to go back there. We don't want to, that's so long ago. And nobody that went through that is living down. So then that further traumatizes. And so as to y'all's point, we wonder why we have these pathologies now that we struggle with. And a bunch of it is because of the trauma that we were never allowed to heal from.
Yeah. And you're not allowed to right. You're not which denies your personhood, right? Right. That it denies and it undercuts my humanity. If I am not allowed to grieve like everybody else, if I'm not allowed to say this hurts like everybody else, if I'm not allowed to declare the defense like everybody else, then what does that mean for my sense of humanity, my sense of dignity? I think one of the things that fascinated me in one of the documentaries I was watching in regards to Tulsa was that I think it was on 60 Minutes, and the dude said he got up in college. He was in college, and the professor said, mentioned the riot in Tulsa. And he said, no, this didn't happen. This is incorrect. He said, I'm from Tulsa. He said, and this did not happen.
Right.
That I'm from Tulsa. And
Wow.
he said there was no talk about it in schools, but more than the schools, there was no talk about it amongst the people who had even gone through it.
Mm.
There was no conversation from those who had gone through it, even in their own communities.
Wow.
Right. And the reality is, and the tragedy is, that is so us, right? At times, you know what I mean? You grow up and, you realize your big sister's your mother. You know what I'm saying? Something, and your when you thought your mother is your grandmother, you know what I mean? All kinds of crazy secrets and things that we do in response, incorrectly, but in response to shame, and guilt, and if we tell the truth about it, it's a very European imperialistic model, but what we do in church sometimes with shame, right? How we use shame to control and dominate and manipulate people from a religious or church perspective. I think the challenge for me is, what is the intersectionality, right? How do we talk about the church being this healing agent for even not just the spirit, but also for the mental health of people? Because that has to be a part of our spirituality, right? Because our spirituality is empty if it does not help our minds. Right? If it does not empower our minds or help us to reshape, right? A very Romans 12 chapter 2 thing, you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed, right? What does that mean? As we talk about the intersection of it. So that to me is the ultimate challenge, I think. How we begin to talk about this in churches, right? How do we begin to talk about this as a spiritual healing, as a spiritual psychological work? That becomes part of the big piece for it,
Yeah.
I don't think it's a problem with those who are on the panel right now, because Pastor Jackson talks about it all the time. And,
right.
and prior to going to Trinity or going to churches, I haven't heard anybody do a sermon or talk about mental illness or talk about how you feel. And we've been so conditioned to not talk about how you feel. But as ministers, as spiritual leaders, it's imperative that we get up and become vulnerable, that we be naked in front of the congregation saying, hey, I go see a counselor and I'm proud of seeing a counselor. I have mental health issues. I deal with anxiety. I'm normal. It's okay. And when they see us talk about it, then as Reverend Kim said, hopefully that will create a safe space for other people to talk about it. But our few churches can't be the only ones talking about it. So when we go to the Proctor Conference, when we go to the Baptist convention, it needs to be talked about in those sermons, in those speeches as well.
Yeah, we need to celebrate. We need to celebrate our sister Naomi Osaka, who walks away from the French Open, said, I care about my mental health, and that's what's the priority right now. Most definitely. Most definitely.
And when the power of this young lady, you know what I mean? Because when you recognize that it's not going to be about making money, right? It's not about making money for other people, right? Which is what happens when you get into that matrix, right? You get into that matrix and people are like, oh no, you got to perform. Oh no, you got to kick out, because now you are responsible for other people's income. So for her to do that, is majorly powerful, like majorly to talk about. I mean, like Black preachers could take a lesson from that book, like for real, like for real.
And you know, the other reality of that, and my time is winding up, but the other reality is that what is it about those press conferences that are so irritating and
yeah,
you know what I mean? Why would that be a part of a press conference that a person feels that they're being ganged up on and beaten down? You see, so not only Naomi, you know, bowing out to take care of herself, but now that's not enough. To go further is to indict those reporters, indict those folk that go there and tell them, get your act together, because you are here to hurt people,
right,
and not allow this to be just a free conversation with people,
right.
And so you got to stop that. You got to stop that.
Makes our boy from the Seattle Seahawks, the Beast, right? Put it in perspective, right? He's like, yo, I don't like reporters. I don't like doing this, because they turn it around, they spin it. And if any of us have been in public ministry in the public square, many of us been in parish ministry for a little bit and have had instances in our communities or whatever, they will turn it around. They will make, I mean, subjective is not a word in reporting anymore. And so I get the angst and the trepidation from it. Yeah, definitely.
It's turning into that hour where we're going to have to close up. This has been our first one back from that hiatus, and we jumped in it hard today. We hit them hard, and we're going to continue this topic. We're going to continue to come on every Thursday, and I just want to give you guys an opportunity, if anybody has a closing statement, just to let it be said now so we can go about our ways and make it happen.
I'm just
closing just with Juneteenth, as we just share the story, right? Tell the story, share the story with our youngins. Tell the story of how we got over. So tell the story. I always say tell the story. I think we don't tell our stories. And then tell our own personal stories, how we got over the liberation. What did it feel once we learned about Juneteenth? Because we've been miseducated for a long time. And so we want to talk about that. I think the first time I realized that, you know, we Black for real, I was upset, because I was like, I've been miseducated for a long time. I'm in my third year undergrad, and I realized this whole world that was closed up to me. So I was a little angry. Dr. Iva Carruthers was the reason for that. And so she was like, well, take that anger and do something. I'm like, well, right now I'm just mad. And I'm in the education field. So now I have to go in and teach more than what is told to be taught. So it's just a whole different animal. But I always say, just tell the story. Just tell the story.
Okay. Thank you guys for tuning in, and make it a great day. Peace.
Peace.
Bye.